Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this 106th session of the International Labour Conference. We are delighted today to have two experts dealing with forced labour. It's the ILO live session, and everything that you would want to know about the forced labour, about how to combat forced labour, and what are the practical initiatives to deal with forced labour. Without further ado, let me introduce you my guest. We have Alex Nasri. Alex Nasri, you are a technical officer on fundamental principles and rights at work, and at the same time you are one of the focal points on the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative. Hutan Omanupur, you are an ILO forced labor specialist, and without further ado, let's try to set the tone of what's behind the forced labor. We know that 21 million people are victims of forced labor. It's generating about $150 billion in illicit profits. What can be done for this scourge? But before that, what is forced labor?
Well, thanks, Gabriel. I think it's very important to define the problem of forced labor simply, that is understood by everyone, not only specialists that work in this area and policymakers, for the general public. And that's one thing that we're working on really raising awareness amongst the general public. Forced labor, very simply put, is someone making someone else do a work that they do not want to do, perform work that they do not want to do by a simple threat. Now, this threat could be even psychological. So that's the very basic definition, if you want, that goes back to our Convention 29 that defines forced labor. And it's in fact one of the oldest conventions that we have at the ILO.
Okay, but we also know that we have several industries where you have forced labor in it. Victims of forced labor are found in agriculture and a couple of other industries. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would hate to pick specific industries and say that they have forced labor issues. I think forced labor exists in every country around the world and in every sector. I think what's really more important to focus on is why it's prevalent in some sectors more than others. Because the workers are low-skilled workers, because they are on the move, they're very often migrant workers, making them more vulnerable. And that's this way, if we deal with the question, then we can get at the root causes, causing the phenomenon and dealing with the issues at the basis, and hopefully eliminating the problem.
Okay. Would you maybe, our viewers would like to know what are the regional trends that we have in terms of forced labor?
Yeah, our latest global estimate was, the number that you said at the very beginning, 21 million. We estimate that at the minimum there are 21 million slaves around the world today, generating illicit profits of $150 billion annually, which I think is also important to point out. And if you look at the breakdown of these 21 million, you see that the Asia and the Pacific has the highest, which I believe is 11.7 million out of the 21. Which is 56% of it. But again, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because if you look at the region, you have the highest density of population in the region as well. And then if you move to the Africa region, it's about 18%. And of course, Latin America, 9%, developing economies and the EU 7%, and the Middle East about 3%, and the Central and Southeastern Europe about also 7%.
Okay, that's so good to set the tone of and having the background of these trends. Alex, can you tell us more about the root causes of forced labor?
I think the root causes are really the thing that the ILO should focus on, because if you want to achieve a sustainable action against forced labor, you need to address the root causes. There are several root causes. Some of them are, poverty and the factors that also lead to poverty. So high rate of unemployment, lack of basic education, but also, other violation of fundamental principles and rights at work, such as the fact that, in certain countries, workers do not have the right to freely associate and bargain. Some workers are discriminated against. There's a lot of discrimination against women, against indigenous people, against migrant workers. There is also a key root causes, which is that sometimes workers are not even covered by the labor law. So they are not even recognized as workers. So how can they really defend themselves against forced labor?
You just mentioned migration issues. So why do you say that migration make workers more vulnerable to forced labor? Could you give us more details?
When you look at our last global estimate, 44% of victims of forced labor have moved either across international frontiers or internally. So it's a big, portion of the victims of forced labor that are migrant workers, in fact. And that's why we also need to focus on, labor migration policies to make sure that they do not put workers at risk.
Okay. And in order to tackle, obviously, forced labor, we have to make sure that workers are not abused since from the onset and at the recruitment stage, obviously. Could you tell us more about what the ILO is doing in terms of promoting fair recruitment, and how does that work?
So since 2014, in fact, we launched what we call the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative. Why? Because we wanted to really look at the first stage in which workers can, enter into a forced labor situation, which is recruitment. And so the initiative is looking at trying to improve the recruitment processes to make sure that workers do not go into any abusive or fraudulent processes. So then they arrive, in the work situation without any vulnerability, which would make them less vulnerable to forced labor. And so we launched this initiative, and this initiative has 4 key pillars, if you want, which drive a little bit our work. The first one is to continue to invest in knowledge on how, why workers are trapped into abusive recruitments that lead to forced labor. So working on the economic determinants to forced labor in the recruitment process, looking at, what are the regulatory framework for recruitment that really led to better protection of workers. So that's the first pillar, really knowledge. The second one is really trying to support our government, our constituents, but the governments more in particular, to improve their recruitment, their legal framework on recruitment, and to make sure that this framework is also aligned with what we call the ILO principles and guidelines for fair recruitment that were just adopted last September. So it's now the new international benchmark on the topic. Thirdly, the third pillar of the initiative is to in parallel of working on the regulatory framework, make sure that we also promote fair business practices, because there are some companies, some labor recruiters that have, taken the additional step to really reform their business model and make sure that they do a due diligence in their operation to make sure that workers are recruited in a fair way, and we promote also those models. And lastly, the fourth pillar is to work with workers' organization to make sure that workers are rightly organized and they can collectively bargain and that they can demand their rights not only at the workplace but also during recruitment.
Okay, that's a very good point actually. For those who just joined us, we are at the 106th session of the International Labour Conference. This is an ILO Facebook Live session on forced labour. A question that we just received from Aurélie, she's asking about demand. Do you think international brands have a role to play? Hutan.
I'd like to thank Aurélie for this question because it's a fundamental question when it comes to dealing with demand. I think we all have a role to play in this. Us as consumers have a role to play in this, to ask questions, to see if the products that we're looking to purchase have been produced ethically. Companies have a responsibility to ensure that their production and their supply chains, global, domestic supply chains, remain fully ethical. I think us as international organizations, the ILO, also have a responsibility. We need to be active in this area, promote the conventions, ensure ratifications. Also the workers, trade unions, they also have a responsibility to ensure that the workers are united and they stand together and they deal with these issues. NGOs also have a responsibility to continue raising awareness on the issue and addressing the needs of the actual victims, all vulnerable people. Absolutely.
Okay. Do you want to add something maybe on this?
Perhaps, on fair recruitment per se, we've been working recently with some international apparel brands in Jordan that source from Jordan to make sure that international brands demand from their suppliers fair recruitment services. So the demanding is clear and can lead to a change down to the supply chain.
Okay. I think now that we have set the tone of things, maybe we can go and move on to the solutions part, concrete solutions. What are the key solutions developed by the ILO to combat forced labor and abusive recruitment? And I'm turning to you, Hutan. Can you elaborate on some of those concrete initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. We heard Alex go very eloquently through the Fair Recruitment Initiative and what we've been doing under the umbrella of the Fair Recruitment Initiative. I'd like to also tell you about a business network that has been created recently in the ILO. It's for companies only. It is to create a safe environment for companies to come together, discuss their successes in dealing with forced labor and human trafficking, but more important than that, discuss their failures and learn from one another and see together with the ILO where are some of the gaps for tools that exist or are out there and how we can work together to create these tools to actually help them address the challenges that they have in their operations around the world. Another recent initiative is Alliance 8.7, linked to SDG Target 8.7, which covers child labor, worst forms of child labor, forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. The ILO facilitated the creation of Alliance 8.7, which is a partnership of partnerships. It's open to anyone and everyone that wants to join it. It has different action groups under it. There is a huge momentum for the alliance. There is donor funding that is coming through for the different action groups. Just to give an example, one action group deals with supply chain issues, for example. One deals with the rule of law. So these different action groups have really some of the most thematic areas that fall under these, the subject of forced labor, slavery, trafficking and child labor, and deals with those issues specifically. And the hope is that will also translate into concrete action at the national level where these violations of labor rights are actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Recently had one ratification. I think it's today. Jamaica ratified the ILO Protocol on forced labor. And then there's a campaign attached to it.
Absolutely. So the campaign 50 for Freedom, it's a campaign that we launched in 2014 after a new protocol. The constituents of the ILO decided that there was need for a new protocol to complement Convention 29 to deal with the realities of forced labor today in our world. So this protocol is a legally binding instrument and it needs to be ratified. So we've launched the 50 for Freedom campaign with the goal of reaching 50 ratifications, at least 50 ratifications. If there are any countries out there, member states watching, it's minimum 50 ratifications by 2018. We're hoping to have many more ratifications by 2018, but that's the objective we've set for this specific campaign. And in parallel, this campaign is also to raise awareness amongst the general public of really this is a reality of our world and it does exist and it's a problem for all of us that we need to deal with and take seriously.
Okay, thank you, Hutan. So again, we're at this 106th session of the International Labour Conference dealing with forced labour issues on ILO Facebook Live. Quick question from Mr. Haptamu. Addressed to both of you. What are the mechanisms for dealing with abusive recruitment of workers? Do we have concrete mechanisms? Alex?
Thank you for this question. I think the ILO added value in dealing with abusive recruitment is to have this comprehensive approach to engage with each key stakeholders in the process. So if you want to achieve fair recruitment. For example, right now we have launched several specific pilot interventions where we look at specific migration corridors and specific industries. So I was mentioning our work in Jordan, for example. We launched a pilot corridor between Nepal and Jordan to make sure that Nepali workers going to the apparel sector in Jordan are recruited fairly. And to achieve this, you need to work on the Jordanian side with the government to make sure that the legal framework is prohibiting, for example, one of our key principles, which is that workers shouldn't pay any fees, any related costs for their recruitment, because if they do, then they fall into a situation of debts that leads exactly to forced labor. So you work with the government to make sure that the framework is aligned, but also with the factories, the apparel factories in Jordan, and with the brands that source from those factories. So they demand fair recruitment services, and they change their views on recruitment. So right now, for example, in Jordan, several factories have changed their practices and are now recruiting workers in a fair manner, which means that workers since the village in Nepal, since their door, are fully informed about what they are going to do in Jordan. They do not pay any fees for their recruitment, and they arrive in a fair manner. On the Nepal side, we also work with the government to make sure that the legal framework is aligned, but we also work with labor recruiters to try to shift the whole culture of recruitment, which has been based on the collection of illegal fees. And we also work with certain civil society actors to build some very effective skills training for workers and pre-departure training, which means that we give really all the information to workers about what they are going to do.
It's actually a good point. A follow-up question here from Caroline. As an employer, what can I do to ensure my employees are recruited fairly? Because sometimes what you think is fairly might not be the fairly in other places. Mm-hmm. So how can you help Caroline here in understanding what employers can do in order to ensure that the employees are recruited fairly?
The beauty of it is that now we have some very clear guidelines on what employers should do that were adopted last October, so they are very new. The first thing is to make sure that they understand what fair recruitment means, because often at the beginning it's a question of, recruitment, specifically the recruitment of migrant workers, is taking place very far away. So, how as an employer in the country of destination can you really, know what practices are going on in the country of origin of the workers? So first, to have a discussion with employers on, what are some of the abuses that are actually taking place, and what are some of the measures that they can take to address this. One of them is to work only with fair labor recruiters that respect ILO standards, and to make sure that all workers that are recruited by this employer do not pay any fees and costs, and are fully aware about their rights and the working and living condition, which means to have a written contract before they leave the workplace, before they leave, the country of origin. And this is quite key to make sure that workers will arrive safely and fairly.
Thank you, Alex.
Can I just add one thing? And also for Caroline, I don't know which company Caroline represents, but one other way is to join the business network, the ILO business network, because these are precisely the issues that we'll be discussing amongst companies. What is their understanding? What do we need to work on? What is a tool that they need to be able to ensure fair recruitment at the country level, at the regional level, at the global level? So these are exactly the questions we'll be answering.
Okay, Hutan, you're again the ILO forced labor specialist, and a very good question here from Ekaterina on data and how it can help combating forced labor. What can you say about that?
Yeah, it's a very good question that Katerina has, and the answer is very simple. If we cannot measure it, then we don't know how well we're doing to deal with it. If we don't have a baseline of the number of people in forced labor, then how do we know if we're going in the right direction? How do we know if our solutions and responses and policies that we promote are actually in fact good? and working to protect and rescue victims of these crimes. So that's why you need to have statistics to be able to measure progress and also to see how effective you're dealing with the issue. Because if our policies are not so effective to deal with the issue over a certain number of years and it will take another 300 years to deal with the issue, then we also need to reevaluate our policies and our responses and see how we can actually improve those in order to address these issues much more quickly.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, both of you came up with practical solutions. But obviously, we have challenges also in implementing those solutions and strategies. What are the key challenges that you see in implementing those strategies? Alex?
There are many challenges, but the good news is that I think now we're really thinking about some innovative solutions to tackle those. One key challenge is for workers, to be aware about their rights and their obligation, and then to be better informed, so less vulnerable to forced labor, is to inform them basically on, for example, on recruitment, what are the safe options they can take for their recruitment. So one thing, for example, that we are doing to tackle this challenge of, transparency and information is to work with trade unions, with the International Trade Union Confederation and their affiliates to create a web-based migrant recruitment monitor so workers can raise their voice on their recruitment experience, and so other workers that go after them can, have an idea of how this experience went, which labor recruiters I should choose. Should I, privilege a private labor recruiter, or should I privilege a public employment service option? So I think that's one key challenge that we are trying to resolve now with this web tool.
Okay. Utan?
I think, excuse me, I think another challenge is really to keep a consistent degree of visibility on these issues and ensuring that as we move forward, dealing with modern slavery, forced labor, human trafficking remain the priority of the member states. Because with all that's going on around the world, countries have a lot to deal with right now. But it's important. These issues are fundamental issues to be dealt with. So that's why I think it's important to keep them on the radar of member states, of the workers, the employers, the general public, the NGO community. Also ensuring that there is enough resources, human resources, financial resources that are being allocated to it in order to address these issues.
Okay. Most of the time, we, when I say we, I'm thinking in terms of, the average Tamu, Mamadou, Tegist, Alex. What can we do at our level, at a citizen level, to try to make sure that this issue of forced labor in concrete manner is eradicated? Alex?
Can complement each other on this one. I think every citizen should be aware that forced labor exists everywhere, in every country, as Houghton said. I hope that this interview today will also raise awareness on this issue among citizens of the world, and that each of us, can take action. When you go to the supermarkets, you look at the different products and you just ask yourself some, key question. Where is this product coming from? Where has it been produced? And I think with this awareness in mind, this is, consumer also pressure. This can also lead to more changes.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Again, as Alex said, become aware of the issue, face the reality that it is a reality of our world today that we live in. It exists everywhere, and take action, become part of the solution, question, get involved, go sign up on the 54 Freedom campaign, receive information, encourage your friends to sign up, share the information that you receive. Stories are being sent by the 54 Freedom platform all the time in order to try to raise awareness. One thing is to educate yourself and learn about it. Another is to take an active role in spreading the word.
I think obviously you both of you have been heard, because a lot of follow-up questions here from our viewers. Lawrence is asking, what role do the host countries have when it comes to migrant workers?
What role the host countries have? The host countries, I mean, I think the fundamental right of every worker is to be respected and to be granted the same working conditions and protections that the local workers have, if you want. So I think that's the number one, ensuring that there are good laws to protect these workers, no matter what their immigration status is good. Ensuring that there are access to remedies available to these migrant workers as well as local workers. I think that's very important. It's important at times to distinguish between migrant workers and local workers, because domestic workers, because migrant workers are usually much more vulnerable. They've left their kind of protection, their families, their communities. They may not speak the languages, but at the end of the day, all workers should be granted the same rights. The fundamental principles and rights at work should be respected for all workers, no matter what their migration status is.
And because of their specific vulnerabilities, I think the host country have to design policy that address and take into account those vulnerabilities, meaning, for example, in access to justice. If you're a migrant worker and you have been abused at your work and you want to go to the court, for example, it's very challenging for a migrant worker to do that, specifically a low-wage migrant worker, because as soon as you go to the court, you stop to be paid. So, how long can you survive? And we know that, sometimes court systems take a very long time. So can you even stay in the country to, follow the legal proceedings? So the responsibility of the host countries is to take this into account, to make sure that, for example, with migrant workers, they give them a recovery period. They can also allow for, temporary residence permit just for the duration of the trial, to put in place those specific policies. Also, for example, free legal assistance. Some low-wage migrant workers, how can they afford to go through a long trial process if they do not have access to free legal assistance? So all those little steps that are specified, in fact, in ILO Protocol of 2014 need to be taken by states to make sure that migrant workers, are not more vulnerable to forced labor.
Okay, well, Lawrence, I hope you have a great answer to your question. We're still at the 106th session of the International Labour Conference here in Geneva at the Palais des Nations. A lot of questions I was mentioning earlier. Again, from Deepika this time. How can workers avoid recruiters who would exploit them? What are their alternatives if they can't find work?
Ask questions. Do your research. Even at the village, level, at the community level, still talking to people, you'll be surprised how much information you can get if you talk to people that have gone through the recruitment process, perhaps, that are aware of the situation. And, it's only human nature that very often we want to believe what we want to believe, and we forget about the reality that's, kind of in front of us. We're looking for a job, we're offered a good job. If it's too good to be true, let's think about it twice, and let's not just go for it and accept it right away because it sounds like an amazing job, it's a dreamed of job we've always wanted. Simply asking questions can help a great deal, I think. And I think that's a good starting point. I don't know what you think, Alex, but I think that's a good starting point.
No, I totally agree. And I think, going beyond this general awareness, for those workers that would find it difficult to get this information, I think that's when the ILO should come in. Basically, we speak a lot about the selling dreams story. Basically, what unscrupulous recruiters do sometimes is that they sell dream in the villages. You will have a great job. This will pay you a lot of money, etc. And I think the objective of the ILO is to cut this asymmetry of information and to make sure that this does not happen, so workers are not deceived.
Okay. Obviously, these question after questions, these trigger obviously another, follow-up questions, and then I think it's very important also to avoid confusion in terms of forced labor. You defined forced labor earlier, but we have a question now again regarding that particular issue from Federica. If a child has reached the minimum age to go to work and actually the parents force him to go to work, should it be considered as forced labor?
It's a great question, but you need to really evaluate each case independently and have a lot of information and analysis to be able to come out with the conclusion that this is a forced labor case or it's not. The ILO has worked on a publication, the indicators of forced labor, which is a list of 11 most commonly found indicators of forced labor. It's publicly available on the ILO website. I invite you to refer to it, read it, analyze it, and with regards to the specific context of the situation and the different indicators that are in that booklet, then you can come up with an answer if you think it's a forced labor situation or not. But there are too many unknowns to just make a general ruling like that right now, unfortunately. But that's how I would respond to that question.
Yeah. Follow-up question from Colleen this time. How can a migrant worker find legal resources if needed? What organization can help him in legal representation? That's also on the ground one of the greatest issues that we have, in terms of legal representation, protection. So what would be the answer here?
I mean, the ILO is working with trade unions. Some trade unions have integrated some legal desks specifically for migrant workers in different countries of the world, and we're supporting this. Some trade unions have also worked with civil society actors that are specialized, the Lawyers Without Borders networks that are specialized in defending migrant workers in those situations. So, there's some referrals in place between trade unions and civil society actors. And I think it's only by really partnering together between those two actors that migrant workers can find solution if they want to access justice and be compensated for the crime they have suffered.
Okay, so we've seen obviously the definition of forced labor. We've talked about the concrete initiatives, of the solutions, perhaps also a little bit on the way forward, and what each and every of us can do on the ground. There's a really interesting question from Joe here. Is it possible to completely eradicate forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, and child labor as outlined in SDG Target 8.7? Or will these abuses continue to occur, perhaps at a lower rates or stage? That's a question from Joe. Hutan?
Joe, I say yes. And I say yes with all the passion that we all put to our work. I say yes because if we didn't really truly believe that we could eliminate these crimes, we would not be doing our job that we're doing. If there was no hope, our job would be a waste of time. I always say this, and I'll repeat it again. The number one objective for us is to put ourselves out of a job. Because if forced labor has been dealt with and it no longer exists, then we're out of a job and we can move to the next labor right violation that exists. So I fully believe that we can deal with the issue, and that's what we're trying to do, but we need your help to get there.
Okay. I think we've touched on most of the subjects, if not all of the subjects. But again, for our viewers, what is really important, at the end of this ILO Facebook session on forced labor, if they have to go back and think or act on some specific case, could you summarize in one sentence? What would that be? Alex, can I start with you?
One sentence. It would be that forced labor is a crime. Forced labor is a crime, not happening very far from you. So get informed about it. Take action. You can really make a difference.
Okay. Hutan, the same question.
ask questions, get involved.
Okay. I think we're in line with this one. Thank you very much for following us. This was an ILO Facebook session on forced labor, what it means, how to combat it, and from the International Labour Conference, 106th session in Geneva, Switzerland. Palais des Nations, thank you. Thank you, Hutan Amanpour, and if you have additional questions, Alex Nasri, I'm sure they'll be in touch. Thank you.